How would you like your answer to that? I mean, I don't even know where to begin.
Hi, yes, thank you. I have to say this is a question for Mr. Weinstein. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity, just having been able to listen to several of the conversations, particularly on the topic here. I want to eschew any paradigms that we've discussed and not take on the general lore that exists and what many people might have talked about. Specifically, it seems like if they found something to keep a secret, it would be about the energy. And it seems to me that plasmoids and fractal toroidal geometry, or quote, low energy nuclear reactions, or coherent energy transformations, and some of the private aerospace work from Jack Machamskin, Charles Chase, Robert Ford, et cetera, have continued a legacy of fusion and electrostatic inertial confinement begun with Winston Bostick in the 50s, electrogravitics from T. Townsend Brown, and then everything closed down by the 60s and went corporate. So I, wonder if looking at people like Ken Shoulders and Robert Grenier and how Puthoff's polarizable vacuum, which has a legacy going back to I think it's H.A. Wilson, 1930 something. So there is a line of things that seem to be, if it's protected, it's the science, and it's because it would have a revolutionary energy paradigm. We're talking about energy, we're talking about propulsion, we're talking about all manner of new forms. I guess my question to you might be how Puthoff mentioned all kinds of toroidal geometries, and toroidal geometries seem to be the secret sauce. And I wonder if you might have heard of fractal toroidal geometry as a metric for understanding plasma or plasmoids, which are plasma toroids. And I know I've given a lot, but it's because I'm just excited to speak with somebody, who has a bigger end on the scene than I do here. But it seems to me that these technologies are the paradigm shift that something like a transnational cabal would want to keep a tight lid on and maybe slow drip what they've discovered. This is Danny Sheehan's thesis of Lockheed Martin's desire for disclosure. So, all that being said, and focusing on the energy and the technology and the hidden physics aspect, which has an Invention Secrecy Act, doing that work. It's not out of nowhere. Um, I wonder what you might be able to comment on there, just to perhaps specifically on coherent energy transformations and low energy nuclear reactions having been cracked at least 30 years ago since Pons and Fleischmann in the public. I think it was done earlier in private. But if DARPA's doing their job, they're 20 or 30 years ahead. Their mission statement's 50. So
How would you like your answer to that? I mean, I don't even know where to begin. Let me let me try, because you're in the unfortunate position of having looked at a lot, trying to squeeze it into a question, and you probably know that there's no possible way I can answer. Um,
yes, I'm
let
afraid I
me
do.
try to
But
figure
I
out
thought I might just conjure some magic anyway out of the try.
Yeah, no,
If you
look,
have to
I'm up for it. I've
reduce,
been in
it's
that
already
situation
solved.
I've been in that situation a million times, and so I'm very sympathetic with your plight. Let me try to find the theme, if I can, in it, and we'll do as best as we can. Forgive me, I'm sourcing an electrical cord at the same time, which is rude. Um, Way too much structure, my opinion, is placed in that question. If you were talking about what I think we're talking about, and I'm not at all positive that we are, I'm not at all positive that this is real, that there are alien craft, non-human intelligence, the odds have gone up. That said, assume that you're on the branch of the decision tree that says, yeah, dude, it's aliens. Um, in that case, you have a situation whereby the physics is likely to be significantly different than anything we know. So the more you wrap um, your current understanding around the question and think about all the specific things you said, the more likely you are to be wrong because it's predicated on what you know. So, for
Well, just to be
example,
clear, I didn't bring
you
up
will find out
aliens at all in my response, and I tried to clear the deck of that.
totally not. You brought up things like, if I may, extended electrodynamics.
Well,
Yes?
I think extended electrodynamics is a first step towards a new paradigm. I see what you're talking about. I'm
I
familiar with
understand.
live. Yeah.
All right.
Read. Go ahead.
Okay. So I've looked at this a little bit. Most people like me have never heard of extended electrodynamics. So one of the things that may be kind of interesting is what is it like to find out that what is called the serious physics community, of which I am already, heretical, but that's much more my play group than Thomas Townsend Brown and stuff like that. So these people have by and large never heard of any of this stuff. Um, and the reason is that I don't even know how to say this. It feels like a lot of this was developed by electrical engineers who know vector calculus. They know fairly sophisticated math that isn't graduate level differential geometry, quantum field theory, all of the really crazy stuff that you usually do if you're a math or physics person around age 23, 25, something like that. And so, mostly what it is, it feels like it's electrical engineers who are pretty close, but aren't aware, for example, of the importance of gauge symmetry. So, a lot of things that you'll see is people will add a term that breaks gauge invariance, and they have no idea why that's a big deal. So, you have no, it's a sort of the Pottery Barn theory of quantum field theory. You break it, you bought it, you didn't even realize you broke something. And you don't understand why it's important. So, just to give that as an example, if you have a fashion model, they will still ask her for her Polaroids. And what those are is a set of pictures in very well defined poses with minimal makeup and clothing that give you an idea what the underlying human being looks like as a full body shot, close up face, profile, three quarters, et cetera, et cetera. Think about all those different shots as choices of gauge. And the underlying field isn't any particular choice of gauge, it's the totality represented by the model herself. In some sense, what a lot of these theories do is they break that gauge invariance and they say, no, 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 I'm not hiring the model. I'm hiring the three-quarter shot, which is a partial profile. And you're like, no, 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 you're not. You're hiring a human being. That's a particular shot that you fell in love with. So a lot of what goes wrong in the conversation is that people don't understand why the professional physics community is up in arms when people are tinkering around and seeing what you could change and how you could do things differently because they don't understand the consequences of their actions. So, one of the things that I'm like, when you say energy, energy is in a certain sense that can be made precise, defined as time momentum rather than space momentum. We have a different name for time momentum. We call it energy. We could call it time momentum as opposed to linear momentum or angular momentum. What happens if you have multiple dimensions of time? Then you don't have one concept of energy anymore. You have multiple concepts of energy. And nobody, in fact, knows how to do physics that well with multiple dimensions of time because almost all of our techniques that come from either Hamiltonian or Lagrangian analysis presuppose that there's one dimension of time. It's just kind of baked into an assumption about what the universe is. So in particular, am guessing that if aliens are here, they're here in a successor to space time. They're not using what we would consider to be energy. They're using energies, and those energies correspond to multiple temporal dimensions. What's more, if you take the DESI results seriously, we probably don't have a cosmological constant. Now, there's this thing called Lovelock's theorem, which many people have forgotten about, which came from the early 1970s, which says if you have the Einstein field equations, the curvature part of those equations, which is what everybody loves, has a property called being divergence free. And it has to do with a certain kind of symmetry called general coordinate invariance. Every other term inherits the same property. And there's only one way of doing that with the dark energy, which is called a cosmological constant multiplied by the spacetime metric itself. And it has to do with a fancy version of the Leibniz rule or the product rule. My guess is that we will find that the cosmological constant dies because it's not right. Dark energy persists. General relativity will have to fall because of Lovelock's theorem. Stay tuned, you heard it here first, folks. And then we will come to understand the successor theory has the dark energy for what's called a vacuum expectation value. That is, it is some field that actually varies in space and time, but is pretty constant because it's caught in what's called a potential. Now, my claim is that if that's a field and not a constant, you might be able to mine the dark energy that's suffused throughout the universe. So it's like having a gas station at every place. If you've ever seen those bumper cars and they've got a connection to the ceiling from which they draw power, but anywhere you go, your bumper car is catching power from the grid that it's on. Once we do away with space-time, once we do away with general relativity via Lovelock's theorem and the dark energy, my guess is that we're going to find that there are alternate sources of energy and, more importantly, energies, because we're going to find that time is multidimensional, and that means there's multiple time momentum. So I'm having a different out-of-body experience with all this UFO stuff, which is I'm excited about it scientifically. And one of the reasons I'm not keen to say yes, it's aliens or no, it's aliens is that I'm not looking for space opera. I'm looking at this as data. And what kind of data it is depends on what science we're going to be able to do. And what's most important to me is that the national security people either brief the scientists differently or get out of the science business. Because what they're doing is they're polluting our own data, where our adversaries are working with the government between their best scientists and the political apparatus and the military. And this is a recipe for disaster unless somehow we've already cracked the code and our plan is to poison our best scientists who aren't actually part of the effort because they are the biggest risk at figuring this out. I know that's long-winded, but you said a lot of things. Take what I just said. That gives you an idea of how far away I am from everybody else's thinking in the space.
Thank you so much. Jesse, go ahead. Nathaniel, I'm going to bring you back up so you can ask your follow-up. Go ahead. Okay. We're going to move on to Brian. Brian, what do you have to
If
say?
that was an invitation, I did get dropped and came back up. I didn't hear if I got accepted and that was an invitation to speak. I don't mean to jump in if that's not the case. I did have
Go
a
ahead.
short.
Go ahead.
If you would, Eric, just as a response, if I may call you Eric, pardon me, Mr. Weinstein.
Let's either do Dr. Weinstein or Eric or Yo. Yo works.
All right. I'll go with Eric now and see if I can feel confident about a yo in a moment. But just
ahead,
briefly, certainly. Uh, the things that I mentioned specifically, following on, I wanted to leave out aliens as a hypothesis because so far I see no evidence of that, and I see all sorts of evidence about privatized classified physics. So the discovery of counter rotation is a principle that's useful. The ability for plasmoids to be able to, Richard Feynman wrote an apology letter in 1986 to Kenneth Shoulders, who was one of the pioneers of discovery of plasmoids because of what they were able to do, which is coupling to this vacuum for this new energy, quote, quote, as you say, or, the polarizable vacuum or the quantum vacuum fluctuations, so-called. So these things are, I believe, quite capable of maybe explaining an entirely deeper psyop. I believe that there's spirits in the sky or something, but I'm just, I don't want to be Scooby-Dooed into thinking that triangles and saucers and Tic Tacs, which are Lockheed constructions, are really the source of, some kind of threat or a boon.
So if I may, look, I just don't know about this stuff, so I'm going to mostly bow out. And I do a lot of this saying I don't know, and I wish more people would say I don't know. It feels like everybody's an expert on everything, and I'm certainly not.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. What I would say is there are certain principles, particularly around symmetry in physics, and I could explain why symmetry is important. Really, it's not symmetry, it's structures. When you have a structure that you assume, the way to keep track of that structure is to ask what symmetries preserve that structure. And that's how symmetries crop up everywhere. It's really not about symmetries, it's about structures, and structures are everywhere. That makes sense. And then you keep track of structures by symmetries. And this has to do with a brilliant lady named Noether and her theorem, which has to do with conservation and symmetry. Okay. A lot of what goes on is that you discourage people from looking for certain effects by saying, that's crazy, that effect won't happen. Two of the most famous happened in the late 1950s, one of which is called the asymmetry of the weak force. Famous experiment with cobalt 60 that you put it in a magnetic field, and naively you would expect that all of the beta decay electrons would be spun out in all directions. And in fact, they are lined up so that there's some weird way in which the weak force, which mediates beta decay, knows its left from its right, whereas every other force seems to be ambidextrous. That was like really shocking. Another one of these things was that the electric and magnetic fields are not the principal aspects of electromagnetism, which is hysterically funny because we thought we knew electromagnetism. And there's this thing called the electromagnetic potential, which we thought was a convenience product for generating the electric and magnetic fields, the E and the B fields. And then it turns out, no. The E and the B fields don't really matter. It's the electromagnetic potential that matters, or more properly, the gauge equivalence of the electromagnetic potential. And that was shown by Aronoff and Bohm, where it's effectively a classical effect that's detected quantum mechanically, where you pass an electron beam around a shielded solenoid. And since there's no measurable E or B field outside, you shouldn't be able to detect if there's current running in the solenoid, if the E and B fields are the stars of the show. And it turns out that you can detect whether there's current in the shielded structure. And why is that? It's because the electromagnetic potential varies with the current. And it's not the E and the B fields that mediate the self interference of the electron beam. Those are two examples of experiments you could try to convince people not to run because the prejudice that these things wouldn't show anything. It's like an example of the effect you're talking about. You basically stigmatize some line of investigation so people don't do the work that's easily doable. All right. Now, is that happening across the board? Is there some story about Heaviside and his formulation of, Maxwell's theory? I don't know about this stuff. I'm very skeptical of it. I don't want to weigh in. It's not impossible, but it's very unlikely. That said, I've given you the two examples that show how you would try to suppress something. It's definitely the case that during the Manhattan Project, we tried to convince people that plutonium and uranium didn't have any special properties as far as radioactive materials to make bombs. And we knew that they did. And we tried to get people to believe that it was much harder. I believed Harold Urey may have used disinformation, that there was all sorts of attempts to pull things from the shelves. So in extreme cases of national security, there's been heavy interference with science. However, most people have no idea what they're talking about. And I don't know how to say that politely. I often don't know when I'm venturing into something, and I try to say this is speculative, and I listen to all of the authority on these Twitter spaces. It just makes my head spin. It's like a lot of people who have no idea what they're talking about, but who've been able to learn something from the internet, which is great. But they somehow, a lot of the modesty is transmitted through the formal education. So when you learn things from the internet, you tend to be too bold. That's my thought.
Thanks, Eric. I've been dying to ask you a philosophical question, though.